My subject is uranium, the deadliest shapeshifter. I want to start off by talking about what makes uranium unique, truly unique in the galaxy of elements on Earth. Uranium was found in 1789. It was named after the planet Uranus, which had been discovered just a little while earlier. And it was just one more element. It was the last on the periodic table, element number 92. And it was moderately interesting. It was used as a coloring for glass and pottery for over 200 years. And then in 1896, things really changed. And suddenly, uranium became a lot more interesting because Henri Becquerel accidentally discovered the phenomenon that we call radioactivity. He had a lump of uranium in a desk drawer, and he found that this rock was giving off some kind of powerful penetrating energy that would go through black paper and expose a photographic plate. And he had no idea what this energy was or where it was coming from and how it could possibly be that a rock could give off energy. It turns out that we now know that the energy comes from the disintegration of the atoms. Most atoms are stable, they never ever change, but some atoms are unstable, and those are the ones we call radioactive. An unstable atom really has an unstable nucleus. The core of the atom is what is unstable. And it's like a little tiny time bomb that will suddenly and violently explode at some unexpected moment. And when it does explode, it gives off what you might call subatomic shrapnel that we call atomic radiation. And this can be a gamma ray, which is like an X-ray, only more powerful, or it can be a particle, an alpha particle, positively charged, a beta particle, negatively charged, or a neutron with no charge. All of these projectiles are extremely damaging to living things because they break molecular bonds randomly. And when they break those molecular bonds, that includes the DNA molecule. And the consequences, the long-term consequences can be very severe for the individual involved. Now, you can't see radiation, but if you put a rock, uranium ore sample in a cloud chamber, then you can see the condensation, and this will allow you to see the tracks of these particles. There they are. They're coming off all the time. They're pouring out of this rock. Now, here's the amazing thing. That's going to go on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for millions of years and millions of years and millions of years. And in fact, it will not fundamentally change in all that time. The energy is just pouring out of that rock. This was mankind's first experience of what we call nuclear energy. It's called nuclear energy because it comes from the nucleus. And radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy which we cannot control. We don't know how to shut this off. We don't know how to speed it up or slow it down. That's why we have a radioactive waste problem, because we don't know how to shut it off. We don't know how to neutralize it. Now, 43 years after the discovery of radioactivity was an even more stunning discovery, and that was nuclear fission. Right at the dawn of the Second World War in Berlin, around Christmas time in 1938, they discovered that using a neutron as a projectile, you can actually split a uranium atom massively in half, roughly 1/3, 2/3 usually. And that allows you to release nuclear energy, a big burst of nuclear energy at will, so that all of a sudden you have something unlike radioactivity. You can control this. By using neutrons, you can bombard uranium atoms and release as much energy as you want. And this is the basis for both nuclear bombs and nuclear reactors. Without uranium, there would be no nuclear weapon of any description anywhere on Earth. And without uranium, there would be no nuclear reactor of any description anywhere on Earth. Uranium is the key to all nuclear fission technology. Other atoms can be split, but only uranium can be harnessed. Now, the reason for this is because of what we call a nuclear chain reaction. There's a very rare kind of uranium called uranium-235. It's only 7 atoms out of 1,000 that are uranium-235 in nature. And it is the only naturally occurring element that can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. What this means is that the neutron is like the magic wand that makes things happen. When it strikes the first uranium-235 atom, that atom splits into 2 chunks but it also gives off more neutrons. And those more neutrons allow you to multiply the splitting of uranium-235 atoms. And if you allow this to multiply in an uncontrolled fashion, you have an atomic explosion of enormous proportions. If you somehow control the neutrons by using neutron absorbers, then you can have a nuclear reactor that provides a steady source of this nuclear energy. Now, just a couple of years after that, 4 years after the discovery of fission, the President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill from Britain, at the invitation of our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, met in Quebec City, and there they signed a secret accord, the Quebec Accord, which was an agreement to cooperate in building the world's first atomic bombs. The reason why Canada was included in this is because Canada had the only readily available supply of uranium in North America. The other supplies in Europe and in Africa were under the control of the Germans, and so they could not be accessed easily. What resulted was 2 bombs 2 years later, and 2 Japanese cities were destroyed, full of men, women, and children. Little Boy destroyed Hiroshima. It was made from almost pure uranium-235. This was difficult to acquire because you had to separate all the uranium-235 out of all the non-uranium-235, the uranium-238. That's called enrichment. And enrichment is a slow and difficult process, technologically sophisticated and requiring enormous amounts of energy. Very difficult to hide that operation. The other bomb, Fat Man, was made from a substance called plutonium. And plutonium does not exist in nature. You can't go mining plutonium, it's not there. But it is a derivative of uranium, and it is produced inside any nuclear reactor that is fueled with uranium. So all nuclear reactors produce plutonium, and the first reactors were built solely for the purpose of producing plutonium for bombs. Now, there's only 2 uses for uranium in terms of the fission property, and that is atomic bombs, such as Little Boy, and nuclear reactors, such as the EBR-2 reactor in Idaho. Now, a nuclear reactor provides a steady source of heat and possibly electricity. It doesn't have to supply electricity, but it also produces plutonium. And in fact, the EBR-2 reactor is what's called a breeder. It was designed to produce as much plutonium as possible. The idea was to acquire plutonium and stockpile it for use for civilian purposes, not just for military purposes, because plutonium can also be used as a nuclear fuel for more nuclear reactors. And the nuclear industry from the very beginning has always dreamed of turning to plutonium as a nuclear fuel. Why? Because uranium-235 is scarce. Uranium-238 is abundant. And uranium-238, all of it, can potentially be converted into plutonium. So you can multiply the fuel supply by at least 100 if you start using plutonium rather than uranium, hence the appeal. Now, the first plutonium bomb that was exploded in Nevada, and Robert Oppenheimer was there, and he came up with the quotation from the Bhagavad Gita by the god Vishnu, who himself is a shapeshifter. And he revealed himself in the multi-armed shape and said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And somehow he captured the mythic importance of the unique property of uranium. It's the only element on Earth that has the potential to make the Earth uninhabitable. There's no other element that you can start with, naturally occurring element, that can do this. Above, you see a picture of 24 avatars of the Hindu god Vishnu. 24 avatars mean 24 different incarnations, and uranium has many more than that. In nature alone, it has 24 incarnations. When you go to nuclear reactors, it has hundreds of incarnations. And when you go even further into the weapons business, you get more incarnations again. So there's lots of avatars for uranium, and that's what my talk is going to be about. Space shifting is the ability to physically transform oneself through an inherently superhuman ability. Now, uranium atoms undergo 3 shape-shifting transformations, and all of them are important to understand. I call them metamorphosis, fragmentation, and impregnation. Metamorphosis is a natural process, like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, And it's what happens as a result of the radioactive disintegration of uranium atoms, giving rise to about 24 decay products, they're called. And those are naturally occurring materials which are found on Earth wherever there is uranium. The second one is fragmentation, and that is because of nuclear fission. With the advent of nuclear fission, breaking these atoms apart, we created hundreds and hundreds, probably more than 1,000 fragments of uranium atoms, which are lighter than uranium, lower down on the periodic table, and which are mostly intensely radioactive. Collectively, they are millions of times more radioactive than uranium itself. And the third one is impregnation, whereby certain uranium atoms like uranium-238 can absorb a neutron and not split, but become heavier and undergo a transformation into a totally new element. And that's how plutonium is born and the other transuranic elements, they're called. So the first example of shape-shifting are the byproducts of radioactivity. Radioactivity, as I mentioned earlier, was discovered 125 years ago by Henri Becquerel. The unit of radioactivity is henceforth called the becquerel. And what a becquerel means is that one radioactive disintegration is occurring every second, or 60 disintegrations every minute, or 3,600 disintegrations every hour. So whenever you see the word becquerel, you realize they're counting the number of disintegrations that are occurring in a single second. And of course, that continues. Now, Marie Curie was very curious about uranium, and 2 years later, after Becquerel's work, she applied her chemical skills, and she crushed up tons of this rock that he was using, this uranium ore, and she chemically extracted the uranium and separated it from all the rest of the residues. And she found that uranium was indeed radioactive, but she found something interesting. The residues were much more radioactive than the uranium. And this led her to believe that there are other radioactive materials that have not yet been identified. She identified two of these, radium and polonium, two of the decay products of uranium. It turns out that there's a whole lot of decay products of uranium. It is one of the primordial radioactive materials on Earth. That means it was there from the beginning of the formation of the Earth. And it all down through these billions of years, it has been producing progeny. Each radioactive disintegration creates a new element called a decay product. For example, radium disintegrates and becomes radon, which disintegrates and becomes polonium. Now, this is amazing because it's as if disintegration, this radioactive disintegration, which we fear because of the damage it does to living cells, is like a magical portal that takes you into a new world. Radium itself is a heavy metal, which is very reactive. It reacts with all kinds of other elements. But when it disintegrates, and by the way, in the human body, it would go to the bones as lead does. But then when it disintegrates, it turns into radon, which is a gas and which doesn't undergo any chemical reactions at all, and which will remain a gas forever. It never turns into a solid or a liquid object. And then when that disintegrates, it turns into polonium, which is a solid that is similar to potassium. And inside the body, it goes into the blood cells and into the soft tissues of the body. So these are totally different avatars of uranium. But please bear in mind that every atom of radon in the whole world started off as a uranium atom. Every atom of polonium started off as a uranium atom. These are all different manifestations of the original uranium atoms. So uranium has a long decay chain. There are 24 progeny. One of the decay chains is for U-238, and there's a similar decay chain for U-235. Here's the decay chain for uranium-238. The black bars indicate the half-life. The half-life is how long it takes for half of the atoms to disintegrate. In the case of uranium-238, it's 4.5 billion years. So it means there's about half as many uranium-238 atoms today as there were when the Earth was first formed, because that's how old the Earth is. And there are all these other elements. You notice that the radium is about halfway down and the polonium is down near the bottom, polonium-210, which Marie Curie found. And when you mine uranium, you take away the uranium, but you leave behind 85% of the radioactivity because they don't like that. They don't want it. So this is ground up as a very fine sand It's very voluminous. It's the bulk of the ore ends up being waste, and it's radioactive sand, and it will be dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. Why? Because it contains an element called thorium-230, one of the decay products of uranium, which has a half-life of 76,000 years. And all through those 76,000 years and longer, it's replenishing the supply of all the other ones below it. So for example, radon gas, you'd think, well, hey, radon only has a half-life of 3.8 days. It should be gone in a few weeks. True enough, if it was all by itself, but it's always being replenished by the decay of thorium-230. So the amount of radon will actually not cut in half until after 76,000 years. So it's important to understand how these radioactive materials are related to each other. Now, here is a pile of sand rock tailings left over from a uranium milling operation in Elliott Lake, Ontario. That wall of tailings, radioactive sand, is about 30 feet high, and behind that wall is an entire lake of such sand. It's about 70 million tons in that depository alone. And that stuff will remain dangerously radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. So obviously it requires permanent, perpetual attention. When they talk about burying nuclear waste because you can't leave it on the surface, well, they're not doing that with the uranium tailings. They are leaving it on the surface. And according to the US Geological Survey, after about the first 1,000 years, the tailings are, although much more voluminous, they are approximately the same toxicity as the high level waste after 1,000 years. So they're in the same ballpark. So they are they represent a severe environmental challenge. At one point, the Wall Street Journal called it an ecological and economic time bomb, the 200 or so million tons of tailings in the US at that time. And of course, the tailings can be so easily scattered because of their sandy condition. They can blow in the wind, they can wash in the rain, they can drift, they can seep into the groundwater. And of course, they give off radon gas, and the radon gas floats through the air. It's 7 times heavier than oxygen, 7 times heavier than the air, rather. So it hangs low to the ground, and as it goes along, it disintegrates into polonium isotopes. So the polonium isotopes are falling out on the vegetation below. And this way you get radioactive fallout from a uranium tailings deposit. Now, the danger of these materials was known from the very early days. By the 1920s, it was known that young girls who were hired to use radioactive paint based on uranium to make numerical dials on instruments glow in the dark, that these girls were dying of horrible diseases caused by their exposure to very tiny amounts of radium. We're talking about millionths of a gram, a few millionths of a gram, called micrograms. There were fatal anemias. That was the first thing that happened. A lot of them developed fatal anemias and died from it. And as did, by the way, Marie Curie and her daughter Irene. Then there were bone cancers. There was an epidemic of bone cancers. And then later on, head cancers. And the head cancers came about because the radium in the bones turned into radon gas, and the radon dissolved in the blood, and the heart pumped the blood up to the brain. And that's how they got head cancers, from the transmission of the internal generation and transmission of radon gas. Of course, radon was also an underground miner's curse. And a lot of the Navajo underground miners died. They were non-smokers, almost universally non-smokers. And they died from lung cancer a great deal, as did other uranium mining populations and other miners as well, not just uranium miners. And that was because of the lung cancers caused by radon. Now, although radon is a gas, it does turn into, it has decay products also. As I said, the polonium isotopes, it has about 7 radioactive byproducts, decay products, and 85% of the lung dose is from the 3 polonium isotopes, polonium-218, polonium-214, and polonium-210, which lodge in the lungs and stay there. You breathe the radon gas in, you also breathe it out. So it goes in, it goes out. And you'd think that when you get away from the place where you're exposed, you shouldn't have any danger anymore. But the trouble is you're carrying this solid stuff around with you in the lungs. Now, the polonium is what was used to murder Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 in London by a small amount in his tea. Amazingly enough, he died, as you probably remember, some of you, a pretty horrible death. And it took them quite a while to figure out what it was that was killing him. It was polonium. The Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory says on their website that weight by weight, polonium-210 is approximately 250 billion times as toxic as hydrogen cyanide. 250 billion times. That's hard to wrap your mind around. It turns out that a small piece of polonium the size of a grain of sugar would be enough to kill 30 men the way Alexander Litvinenko was killed. And I did a calculation from uranium mining. For every ton of uranium that is extracted from any ore body in the earth, the tailings contain approximately the equivalent of 18 tons of hydrogen cyanide in the form of polonium-210. So there's a lot of toxicity in the tailings, far more so than in the uranium that's taken away and used. Also, polonium-210 causes up to 90% of the deaths attributed to tobacco. And that's because those same solid byproducts of radon get stuck onto the tobacco leaves, which are very sticky. And when they're harvested and rolled into cigarettes and people smoke them, they're inhaling polonium into their lungs. The polonium also goes into the bloodstream and causes cardiovascular problems. And so there's about 480,000 Americans every year that die from the results of smoking, including secondhand smoke. 90% of that means we have about 430,000 deaths every year from polonium-210 right today in the United States of America. Every year, sorry, not every day, excuse me. So I now want to talk about the second example of shape-shifting. That was having to do with what happens in the ground, what happens in nature. But you know, in the ground, it's locked up in the earth. We're the ones who bring it to the surface and scatter it around in the form of a finely ground sand. So we make it far more available to the environment of living things by mining uranium. And for this reason alone, a lot of people are very much opposed to uranium mining. We had 23 medical doctors in Quebec here who wrote an open letter to the government of Quebec saying that if the government did not ban uranium mining, they would quit their jobs at the hospital they were working at and leave the city they were in, Sept-Îles, and possibly leave the province because they felt that strongly about not having uranium mining in the area where they treated people for medical problems. Now, the second example of shape-shifting is from nuclear fission. Uranium-235 atoms are split, producing these broken fragments, becoming hundreds of new radioactive elements. This is another photograph by Robert Del Tredici. Many of these photographs are Bob's, and he's on the call today, I noticed. When the uranium nucleus is split, this is in Russia. The man in front is called Kurchatov. He's the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. And in the background, we have a monument to the splitting of the atom, the splitting of the uranium atom. And the semicircles symbolize the energy that is released at that moment, because the forces that hold the nucleus together are the strongest forces in the universe. And when you split the atom, you release this enormous energy, which is locked up in the core of the atom. It's ironic that one of the smallest objects in the universe contains the strongest force in the universe. But you also get these broken pieces represented by the hemispheres, which are called the fission products, and they are fiercely radioactive. This man is an actor. He's holding a simulated uranium fuel pellet, and he's saying, "Small wonder," that's the name of the ad, "Small wonder," from the Canadian Nuclear Association. It's saying, can you imagine that you get as much energy from this little pellet as you would from a carload of coal? And it doesn't give off any carbon dioxide when you split it. And he's right. But what he doesn't tell you is that after you use it for that purpose, you can't throw it away. You have to keep your eye on it for the next 10 million years, because it has become one of the most dangerous objects on Earth, irradiated nuclear fuel. In fact, this man would be dead as a doornail if any one of those fuel bundles had been used inside a nuclear reactor and it was a used fuel bundle instead of a fresh one. It would look exactly the same, but it would be deadly. This man standing in front of the face of a CANDU reactor, a Canadian type design, with fresh, unused fuel bundles because the reactor has never been started up. After the reactor is shut off, after it has been running for a while, the radioactivity of the nuclear fuel waste continues. And it would be a blast of gamma radiation that would kill any human being that came close to that core without very special shielding. In fact, when they take the spent fuel out of the reactor, they have to cool it in a big tank of water for, in Canada, it's 10 years. Why? Is that because they're so very hot? No, they're not that hot. Actually, they are hot. But what's important is that they are generating heat. Each one is like a miniature little oven. And if you leave it alone and don't remove the heat as quickly as it's produced, the temperature will go up and up and up. And inside the reactor, that will drive the temperature right up to the melting point of the uranium, which is twice the melting point of steel. So 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 3,800 degrees Celsius, just by the radioactivity alone. This is after the reactor has been totally shut down. It's only the radioactivity that melts the fuel, not the fact you've stopped the neutrons, you've stopped the chain reaction. That's not happening anymore. But the radioactivity, that's what happened at Fukushima. 3 reactors melted down, and a 4th one blew itself to kingdom come at Fukushima. And that was all self-inflicted damage. That was not from the chain reaction. It was not from the machinery. It was strictly from the radioactive waste inside the reactors. So the melting of the core and the explosions of these buildings was due to the heat that could not be shut off. Radioactivity cannot be shut off. And that's why it's such a huge problem. Now, here's a list of selected radionuclides in used fuel after 10 years of being out of the reactor. And it's a list of 211 different radioactive materials, most of which were never seen before on Earth prior to 1939. And they're all created inside every nuclear reactor, whether it's a small modular reactor, whether it's a big reactor, whatever kind of reactor it is, believe me, you get the same kind of waste coming out of all of them. And the potential for a nuclear accident is simply the potential for something that will release those materials into the environment. That can happen with any reactor of any description and any design. Don't let anybody tell you that these reactors are safe, because inherently they are not safe. They have mechanisms which are designed to try and make them safe. But inherently, if you disperse the contents of any reactor into the environment, you have a catastrophe. Now, these radioactive fission products are chemical substances which are also radioactive. They have their own unique pathways through the environment and through the human body, depending on their nature. And so here we have a diagram that shows some of these materials. Not all of them are fission products, but some of them are. For example, iodine-131, which has an 8-day half-life. You've heard about this. It goes to the thyroid gland, and 5,000 children in Belarus had to have their thyroid glands surgically removed because of contamination with iodine from the Chernobyl accident. We're now hearing about thyroid problems in Fukushima in Japan, which is not unexpected at all. In fact, it's been reports have been going on for many years already. Each one of these diseases has a certain latency period. You have to wait several years. For thyroid cancer, it's about 5 to 10 years before you really start seeing the increases that we're now seeing in Japan. Now, cesium-137 is another nasty material. It goes to the meat, it goes to the fatty tissues, and that's because of the chemistry of it. And there's where it does its damage. So it becomes an internal emitter. And this is why the meat can't be sold for human consumption, because the animals are contaminated. They're not necessarily sick, but if the humans eat the meat, they could very well get sick. Some of them will get cancer and die. So consequently, that meat has to be taken off the market. It can't be sold. And similarly, strontium-90. Now, strontium-90, you don't hear so much about it, but it's very dangerous as well. The reason you don't hear so much about it is because it's very hard to detect. Unlike cesium-137, which you can see with a Geiger counter, because it goes tick, 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 tick. With cesium-137, you don't hear anything because it gives off beta radiation, which cannot be detected except in close quarters. So unless the meter is very close to it, you won't know it's there. And that goes to the bone and causes bone cancer. And it also goes to the teeth and mother's milk. It causes blood diseases as well. So the health effects of ionizing radiation, as it's called, are well known. The chronic exposures to these insults increases the incidence of cancer, leukemia, and genetic damage primarily. Also strokes, heart attacks, and other blood diseases. And it has now been well established that if for in utero exposure, for infants who are exposed while their pregnant mothers are being exposed, really, it causes low intelligence in young children. It's almost directly proportional to the dose they get as to how it affects the intelligence. But there is a time delay. The onset of disease occurs years or decades after exposure. What happens basically here is that the cells are damaged in such a way that they're able to reproduce, and it takes them a long time to develop into an observable cancer. In the case of lung cancer, for example, the latency period is 20 years or more. But after that 20 years is up, you not only see an increase after 20 years, but you also see that same increase after 30 years, after 40 years, after 50 years. Once you've reached the latency period, the British Columbia Medical Association calls that a gradually flowering crop of radiation-induced cancers. Now, this graph shows the radiotoxicity. Radiotoxicity means when you get it inside your body, when it becomes an inside emitter, how toxic is it? And it depends whether it get lodged, which organs it gets lodged into, and how sensitive those organs are, and how much energy the radiation carries with it, and so on. So the radiotoxicity of 1 year's worth of spent CANDU fuel from just one reactor over a period of 10 million years. And it starts off with a volume of water. What they're talking about here is how much water would you need to dissolve this down to the maximum legal levels of contamination of drinking water. So for each one of these radioactive materials, there's a legal maximum, right? You can only have so much per liter, right? And it's a small amount. And so how much water would you need to dilute all this waste down so that all of the criteria would be met? And the answer is, on the left-hand side, 1 year out of the reactor, it's approximately equal to the volume of Lake Superior. And that's only for one reactor operating for 1 year. So you can imagine why people say that this waste has to be 100% safely contained for millions of years. In fact, the US Geological Survey says even after 1 million years, the amount of water needed to do the same job, to dilute the waste down to the maximum concentration levels permitted by law, would take almost all the water in the Great Lakes for the US inventory at the present. That was all right back in 1978, by the way. So that would be more now. Now, the longevity of nuclear waste, oftentimes people say, well, it's mostly plutonium, which has a 24,000 year half-life. That's the main problem. If you've got the plutonium out of there, then it should be clear sailing. You don't need to have such a huge, long time to wait. But that's not true. Here are some very long-lived fission products. And look, there's an iodine isotope down there, iodine 129. It has a half-life of 15,700,000 years. That means that all of the iodine 129 that was created in any reactor in the world for all those years is still there, underground, still waiting to come out. It's still there. And you haven't reduced it hardly at all. There would be some diminution, but it would be very, very slight. Similarly, cesium-137 only has a 30-year half-life, so it's gone after maybe 600, maybe 6,000 years. But look, cesium-135 has a 2,300,000 year half-life. So don't fool yourself into thinking that a few centuries is going to make it safe. This is simply bafflegab from the nuclear industry. They prey on people's ignorance. They know that people don't know this. Technetium-99 has a half-life of 210,000 years. And the thing about these things, technetium, cesium, and iodine, is they're very mobile in the environment. They vaporize easily, and so they can get out of the repository much more easily than something like plutonium. It's a lot harder for plutonium to get out than some of these things to get out. And also, these things are very bioavailable. When they're in the diet, when they're in the environment, they get into the human body very easily, and they get into different organs very easily. Not so easy with plutonium. Plutonium is a little sluggish in that regard. So although plutonium is no doubt extremely dangerous, I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying that it doesn't have the mobility of some of these other materials. There's also activation products. Here are some activation products. What is an activation product? Well, I'll explain that in a moment. These are the things in the structural materials themselves that are buried as well. And they have long half-lives. Look at chlorine 36, 300,000 years, calcium 41, 100,000 years. And what is an activation product? Well, it's another way of creating radioactive materials. A neutron hits a non-radioactive element like cobalt-59 in the steel and turns it into highly radioactive cobalt-60. And that cobalt-60 is a real health hazard for the workers who are decommissioning, because they've really got to watch themselves. They could easily get a lethal dose of radiation from the cobalt-60. That's not created in the fuel. That's created in the actual structural materials themselves. So the third example of shape-shifting is byproducts of breeding, what I call impregnation. A uranium-238 atom absorbs the neutrons and becomes heavier. Plutonium is only one example. There's curium, there's neptunium, there's americium, there's einsteinium, there's a whole bunch of them. And even plutonium, there's 6 varieties of plutonium that are created inside the nuclear reactor. And these are particularly dangerous because of their weapons use. The creation of plutonium takes place, as I illustrate here, by a neutron hitting a uranium-238 atom and changing it into a plutonium atom after giving off a couple of beta particles. So this is where plutonium comes from. And once it's created, it cannot easily be uncreated. It can be used for nuclear weapons now or thousands of years from now. Long after nuclear power has been forgotten, people can go to where the waste is buried, and if it's not buried deeply, they can dig it up very easily and get the plutonium out and make a whole lot of bombs. This is how much plutonium is needed to destroy a city. It's about 6.2 kilograms. This is the exact size of the ball of plutonium in the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. And it's also used in H-bombs. H-bombs are called H-bombs because of hydrogen. It's because they use fusion instead of fission, but they also use fission. You have to have a fission reaction to get the fusion reaction going. And that ball of plutonium at the top is what you need to raise the temperature to 50 million degrees Celsius so that the fusion reaction can start. And when they dismantle H-bombs, what they do is they just take that plutonium out of it. When you take the plutonium pit out, it's no longer a bomb. It's no longer something that can destroy a city because it's rendered harmless. But you still have that plutonium, and the question is, what do we do with that? That's a real problem, because we don't have an easy answer to it at all. Now, the present inventory, if we just take a look at can-do used fuel, the other thing that you have to remind yourself is that every single reactor on the planet that is fueled with uranium produces plutonium. For example, in our can-do reactors here in Canada, today, we have in 50,000 tons of fuel, we have about 200 tons of plutonium. That's enough to make about 32,000 Nagasaki bombs. If we waited 24,000 years, it would be half as much, because that's the half-life. If we wait another 24,000 years, it'd be half again. If you wait 96,000 years, you'd still have 12.5 tons of plutonium, which is enough for 2,000 bombs. So it's important to realize that this really is a forever problem. It's a problem that we can't turn our backs on. We can't just pretend that if we bury it and walk away from it, that it's perfectly safe. And by the way, if there's 12.5 tons of plutonium left, you might wonder, where's the other 188 tons? Where's the other 188 tons? Guess what? How many people can guess what the 188 tons is? It's still there, but it's no longer plutonium. You know what it is? It's 100% enriched uranium-235. Because when plutonium disintegrates, it turns immediately into uranium-235, which is the other nuclear explosive material. So in fact, you may be only to build 2,000 bombs with the plutonium, but you've got all that 100% enriched uranium that you can also make bombs with. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Now, one of the things that the nuclear industry has always wanted to do, and it's important to be aware of this, is they want to get at that plutonium, not to make bombs necessarily, but to make fuel for more reactors. They want to keep this thing going. They've got a good thing going and they want to keep it going. And in order to keep it going, they feel, rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly, that they should get that plutonium because that will extend the fuel base. There's more than enough uranium, by the way, to run all the reactors in the world for quite a time. But there is a radioactive firewall between the used reactor fuel, Bob drew this picture, and the bombs. You can't get the fuel to the bombs because it's so radioactive, it'll kill anybody who tries to handle the fuel. It's so radioactive. So what do? You build a reprocessing plant. A reprocessing plant removes the firewall. So now you can take the spent fuel, put it in the reprocessing plant, which separates the plutonium from the rest of the garbage. Once that plutonium is separated, it's no longer highly radioactive. That might sound surprising to you because plutonium is an alpha emitter, and the radiation that it gives is an internal problem mostly. Unless it's inside your body and unless it's not in a bomb, it's not likely to really cause you fatal harm. It's inside the body that causes harm. So it's actually fairly easy to handle in the sense that you can make your choice. You can either put it back in the reactor or you can put it into a bomb. And this is the key to proliferation of nuclear weapons, which by far is every bit as much of a global problem as global warming. Global warming is indeed an existential crisis. So are nuclear weapons. How useful are new nuclear plants in combating climate change and also in therefore saving our skin on that account? And the answer is, there is an assumption or assertion that is being promoted by the nuclear industry and not being effectively combated yet by knowledgeable people, that new nuclear power is needed to combat climate change. Renewables are not sufficient. This is a dictum which amounts to a dogma. It is an unproven scientific hypothesis, which is essentially a power play to grab the money, because the nuclear industry realizes that trillions of dollars are going to be made available by governments for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They want to grab as much of that money as they can. And so they're portraying themselves as saviors. In fact, they're much too slow and much too expensive to make it worthwhile. They're about 4 times more expensive than renewables, and they're about 4 times slower to install than renewables. That's a hell of a disadvantage, but you don't hear so much about it. So the question is, are our energy strategies fast enough to meet the climate emergency? Let's consider the history of the nuclear industry. If you look at the World Nuclear Institute data, you see that nuclear energy has been stalled for 25 years. There's 25 years of absolutely flat, arrested development. In 1996, there were 438 reactors. In 2019, there were 442 reactors. That's almost exactly the same number. So nuclear power is going nowhere fast. And the nuclear industry knows it. And that's why they're pushing so hard to grab this money and to build new reactors, because they think that maybe they can pull the fat out of the fire. Right now, they're going down in flames. And around the year 201, the industry announced that a renaissance was on its way. There were going to be thousands of new large reactors built all around the world, and it was going to be glorious. Well, it turns out, as a result of this talk about a nuclear renaissance, there was a sharp spike in uranium prices, which led to uranium exploration activities all over the place, in Virginia, in Quebec, in British Columbia, in various parts of the United States. It was all based on a fiction because there was no renaissance. The renaissance was a fiasco. In fact, if we just there were only a handful of reactors that were actually ordered during this time. If we look at the one in Finland, the Olkiluoto Unit 3, it was originally estimated to cost 3 billion euros. By 2012, it was up to 8.5 billion euros, and it could possibly be going to 11 billion, which is about 16 billion Canadian dollars. So huge escalation. Also, it was originally supposed to start up in 2009. It only started up now. That's 2022. So it's 11 years late and 5.5 billion to 8 billion euros over budget. And in fact, it bankrupted the Areva Corporation, which tried to build the thing in the first place. We have a similar situation with Georgia in the United States. As you're probably well aware, the Vogtle plants in Georgia, they are the first new reactors to receive construction approval in more than 30 years in the United States. And they consist of 2 Westinghouse units. They're planned in 2006. The estimated cost was 14 billion. Shortly afterwards, it came to 25 billion in 2019. And by the way, as you probably know, the 2 reactors in neighboring South Carolina were canceled after spending $9 billion on it. and there are criminal charges in connection with that one. So this renaissance was a fizzle. It didn't go anywhere. And that's likely to happen with these small modular reactors. They talk about small modular reactors. They said, well, we didn't do well with the big ones. Maybe we can sell the small ones. Nuclear power is too costly, too slow, so it's zero use to Australia's emissions plan. That's Greg Jericho in Australia. And it certainly is true. Here in Canada, we have a statement that over 100 groups, 150 groups have signed saying nuclear power is a dirty, dangerous distraction from climate change, from fighting climate change. If you look at the US energy information, the global primary energy consumption by energy source, that green line represents renewables. It's growing faster than anything. It's growing like a bat out of hell. And that's really the fastest, cheapest thing to do for the short term. Now, whether that can do the job completely, we don't yet know, but we do know that it's the best thing to do now. It's the fastest way to get results now. And we should see what it can do before we turn to other alternatives. And nuclear should not be the first choice. It should be one of the last choices as an alternative. Here in Germany, for example, they decided, as you know, to phase out of nuclear altogether. Many people don't know that in 2011, 8 of their 17 reactors were shut down overnight. In 2021, 6 of them are still operating. And today, only 3 are still operating. Total of 26 nuclear reactors are now being dismantled and 3 are already finished. There's 30,000 megawatts of wind were installed in 8 years. That's twice as much as the whole Canadian nuclear industry, which is less than 15,000 megawatts. Here we have in the foreground a picture. I believe this picture was not taken by Bob, although he visited this place. It's an experimental breeder reactor in Germany that never operated a single day and has been turned into an amusement park. There's a similar situation in Austria where they had a completely finished nuclear plant. They've turned it into a kind of an indoor garden because it's never been contaminated with radioactivity. So that's what we should be looking at, and that's what we should be thinking of. Germany more than doubled its offshore wind power capacity in 2014. Can you imagine any nuclear enterprise that would double its capacity in 1 year? And yet, in offshore wind, you can put them up pretty quickly once you've got the hang of it. Even China, they talk about China building a lot of nuclear, and it's true. They're talking about a nuclear power generation capacity of 49 gigawatts from 50 reactors with an additional 17 gigawatts under construction. That's nothing to sneeze at. That's a lot of nuclear construction. But at the end of 2020 also, China had already installed 281 gigawatts of wind power and 253 gigawatts of solar power, making a total of 534 gigawatts, not megawatts, gigawatts of non-hydro renewables. So you can see that to meet its 2030 goals, China plans to move to more than double its wind and solar power generation, over 1,064 gigawatts in the coming decade. This is 10 times the nuclear capacity already, and the plans look more like 16 times its nuclear capacity. So even China is going very strongly in the direction of renewable. Now, what keeps these guys going? I believe that we should not overlook the mythic dimensions of nuclear power and the challenges ahead of us. I like the Lord of the Rings. You know, the ring of power is a ring that is too powerful for any mere mortal to wear because it gives you such power that it takes control of you. And you find that instead of you being the master of the ring, it is the master of you. And I believe that that's what we're facing with nuclear technology. That nuclear technology has this fatal fascination for intelligent and ambitious people that once they put that ring on, they just can't take it off. They'll do anything to keep the enterprise going. And here's another picture that also has mythic connotation from Robert Del Tredici again. These young women, in Kazakh women, have just learned on the day this picture was taken that high-level liquid radioactive waste was dumped into the Techa River that flows past their village decades ago, explaining a rash of terrible diseases that took place over the intervening years. High-level radioactive liquid waste results from the reprocessing of irradiated nuclear fuel to recover the plutonium for use as an explosive or as a fuel. The medical doctors in this area in the Soviet Union were not allowed to use the word radioactivity. They were told to use the word vegetative syndrome. that your men and women and children are dying of vegetative syndrome. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. And I hope it's been of some use to you.